I always feel like the due on sale clause is something that's made out to be much scarier than it actually is. Because in theory, it definitely can be intimidating, just getting into it or worrying that it'll happen every time. But in practice, like you said, it's not what banks are built to do. They don't want to keep creating non-performing assets.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Creative Financing Podcast. I'm Nicole Kamanjian. I'm here with Cody Richard and the host of this show, Jeff Rappaport. This is episode 256, and today we're doing part 2, all about wraps. Before we get started, I wanted to mention some of our resources. If you're looking for a mentor, visit roimentors.com to learn more about Jeff's apprenticeship program and the Creative Financing Academy. For networking and questions, make sure you join the Creative Financing Podcast community in Facebook. The second Thursday of every month, don't miss Jeff's free creative financing class on Zoom. And if you're local to the Salt Lake area, we host an in-person meetup at Club 90 in Sandy, Utah. Details in the description below.
If you are just joining us and did not listen to our last episode, part 1, all about wraps, make sure you go back and listen to that. That'll give you a little bit of a foundation on what a wrap mortgage is. We went through some terminology, some different things that you need to know about it. And now we're going to continue on with that discussion. What is a wrap discussion without a discussion about due on sale clause and how it can affect a wrap note? Nicole, do you know what a due on sale clause is?
Yeah, when the bank finds out that the property has been transferred and they're basically saying, like, now you owe the remainder of the loan. Right?
In essence, yes. More technically, it's if the bank were to find out that title has transferred, that they have a clause in basically every mortgage that says that they have the right to accelerate the amount due all at once. So what they're saying is, if you transfer title to someone else, and you don't pay us off, that we have the right to get paid off. So due on sale clause is something that we need to be aware of doing any kind of owner finance, and in a lot of cases, any kind of creative finance. Last episode, we talked about how I had a loan called due many years ago. It was probably 17, 18 years ago. And they basically just let me assume the loan with no qualifying. I can't guarantee that that's what's going to happen if you had a loan called due.
Yeah, have you heard other stories of other
Oh, yeah.
investors that have had them called due recently?
Yes.
Like more recently?
Yes. And I would say that it'll range depending on who the lender is, maybe depending on what's going on in the market. It will certainly depend on the bank's situation too. And I'll tell you what to me, the best things to try to do if a loan gets called due, but this isn't going to be about strictly due on sale, right? We're talking about wraps. And so what I want to do is just make it clear of what could happen, what you probably should do, and should this be a major concern of yours? All right. So what this means is if you buy a property with owner finance, the title goes into your name. So Cody, you're buying a property from me with owner finance, and whether it goes in your name or your company name doesn't really matter. But the bank were to find out and they call the loan due, that would mean that they would actually start a foreclosure process. You may either have to sell the property, refinance the property into your own name, and pay them off. Or in some cases, like I said, the bank may allow you to assume it, more than likely qualifying. Let's say that for whatever reason, you don't want to do that. My guess would be most investors will not want to do that, right?
Yeah.
Or can't do that, which is probably a better thing. One of two things will usually happen. Okay. The first one, I think people are a little confused. Nothing happens, right? So maybe the bank is trying to contact you and you ignore them. And maybe it's just a threat. Or maybe you talk to them and they say this is what they're going to do. On the next slide, I think we're going to talk about what actually it means to put the due on sale clause into effect, what it actually does to the bank. You will find that sometimes it's just a threat. and they're not willing to carry it through. This,
Yeah, I'm curious why they would make it and not follow through, but it sounds like we're going to cover that.
yeah.
But like, why make the threat at all if they wouldn't carry it through? Liability, I guess.
So some banks may actually have a policy that if they were to find
Mm-hmm.
out that the loan isn't with the original borrower, that it's their policy to do that. Do they really want to do it? Yeah, you'll tell me after we go through the next few slides. Also, it may be that the person that's contacting you isn't necessarily the person that would be carrying out the situation. These banks are big. There's lots of
Yeah.
departments, and is this really the thing that means most? Is it the biggest priority for them? So the second thing they could do is they could start the foreclosure process, and depending on where this property is, the foreclosure process can be completed in as little as 30-ish days to several months. So you it's not like you will immediately have to figure something out, but you may have to do it fairly quickly. And keep in mind that a foreclosure with the original borrower, that borrower still, it's their credit that's on the line here, could be harmed by this whole thing. So don't forget that part. In my experience, most banks don't call loans due, whether they know about it or not. And my gut, I feel like most banks know that properties have been transferred.
I remember you mentioning a certain bank in Utah that would almost always call it due. Like,
Uh-huh.
so it sounds like there's some nationally that are more prone to calling it due and following through on it. Is that fair to
Well,
say?
like in last episode, we talked about reverse mortgages. Those loans will always be called due.
Hmm.
Another type of loan that will typically always be called due is when a bank makes a loan and is willing to loan a portion or all of the down payment. So, like in Utah, it's called Utah Housing Authority, and they will call the loan due. That there will be those types of lenders nationwide that more likely call loans due. Most of the banks that you're dealing with are going to be, servicers. So Mr. Cooper or any number of the servicers out there, or you're dealing with Wells Fargo, Bank of America, some of the bigger banks. But I believe that most of them probably have a pretty good idea. That they see the change of insurance, or they see they're somehow notified about the change in title. Sometimes they care, sometimes I don't think they do. So let's talk about what happens with the bank if they call a loan due.
Hmm.
So to call the loan due, now here's the biggest one is if you just bought my property, Cody, a lot of times that people that buy, let's say, subject to or owner finance is because, hey, I haven't been making my payments and I'm behind, right? And then you come in and you say, I'll make them, I'll bring them current, and I'll continue to make them. Okay. So now the bank is getting payments, and for them to call the loan due, they have to refuse your payment. They can't accept your payment and say, you got to pay us off. So that kind of defeats their purpose, right? Banks are in the business of making loans to collect what, Nicole?
Payments.
Payments. So it'd be kind of foolish to say, no, here's your payment back. Don't really want it. When they're calling a loan due, banks are taking a note that's performing and making a non-performing note. Okay. Normally they don't want to do that voluntarily. They get penalized for doing that. And I don't know the exact ratios, but banks get 9 or 10 to 1 ratios where if they have a non-performing note for, let's say, $1 million, that may cost them $9 million in a lending power until that non-performing note is resolved. So again, doesn't make a lot of sense for banks to call lots of loans due. Pretty much the bank has two ways of finding out that title is transferred. You or the seller tells the bank. That was my situation a few years ago. and then change in insurance is done improperly. There may be another one like title company that you go through does something foolish, but those are primarily the ways that the bank is going to find out. Maybe you could put in there that randomly by accident they find out or something, or you didn't do a very good job of collecting the information that you need to communicate effectively with the bank after you buy this property, right? So you're going to want online access to the mortgage. You're going to want authorization to release. You're going to want to change the mailing address for any mortgage statements. You're going to want a limited power of attorney, that kind of stuff. And if you didn't have it, now how you have to try to get something done might alert the bank to something. But remember, I could call a bank and just because I'm talking to someone on the bank, if I told them, hey, I just bought this property and I didn't pay it off, it may be someone at the bank that doesn't even know what I'm talking about, that doesn't care, that has nothing to do with that. So really depends on how big the bank is. All right. So let's talk about some different ways that we can avoid the due on sale clause. And then ultimately, how do you want to deal with it? We could buy and sell on contract for deed, land contract, agreement for sale, or whatever else it may be called around the country. These are the kinds of strategies that allow the seller to remain on title. Now, technically, does this violate the due on sale clause? It's a very gray area because title doesn't transfer. However, ownership kind of does. So what I would say is that you would have a very decent case if it all went to court. And I really don't know, again, how they would prove it or find out about it if title hasn't transferred. Again, someone either tells them, and then I'm not even sure what they could do about it. So probably a pretty safe way to go. You could use lease options and options. Again, here's the key thing. Owner stays on title, right? Ownership doesn't change hands. It's really a rental agreement to begin with, and not necessarily violating the due on sale clause. Here's what my opinion is about it is stop worrying about it so much. Do what you can do to set something up. I mean, if you did 100 of these, you're not having 80 of them called due. It's not going to happen. Could you have one or two? Could happen. If it did, what are you going to do about it? You might not have to do anything. Maybe you just ignore them and it goes away. But be ready. Have a plan. Maybe you don't have a plan for all 100, but you have a plan if something got called due, right? And go back and look at some of the episodes we did with Nick Legamaro and Eric Sage about how to set up your sale where you could sell off a note and pay off underlying debt. Look at structuring deals that way where, hey, worst case scenario comes into play, that you have some exit strategies to get out of it.
Yeah, I always feel like the due on sale clause is something that's made out to be much scarier than it actually is. Because in theory, it definitely can be intimidating, just getting into it or worrying that it'll happen every time.
Yep.
But in practice, like you said, it's not what banks are built to do. They don't want to keep creating non-performing assets. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to just have a plan in place and then just keep pushing forward.
So you could ignore the bank if the bank were to reach out to you, or you could just have a very honest and frank conversation like, hey, do you really want to do this? I mean, you're actually in a stronger position than you were prior to this, right? Because you still have the person on the loan that's liable for the loan, and they want to make sure those loan payments get made because it's their liability. Well, now if I bought the house, I might not have the liability, but I put money into this, right? I've either given money to the house in terms of bringing it current, repairs, whatever, or payments or down payment to the seller. And hey, I've got something to lose too. So the chances of this going into default, now we got to get through two people rather than one. And If the goal really is to maintain payments, which it should be for the bank, why? I mean, this is a stronger position to be in. And then I would probably say, all right, so I assume this happens all the time, right? Because it's not illegal. You can look on the HUDs on every title company's their settlement statement, and you can find a place for subject to or owner finance. It's done all the time. If the due on sale clause was, such a problem, no one would be doing it. Everyone's doing it. So what can we work out? How do we get this figured out and see what they're open to? It's not their first time calling a loan due, but I would tell you that ultimately you're going to make a decision, and that decision is: do I stay away from it completely because I'm so afraid of it, or hey, I know people that have been doing I mean, I've been doing it 22 years. And I've had 2 loans called due. The second one I ignored, and nothing happened. I sold the house fairly quickly, but they didn't proceed with anything, and I don't know that they would have. And in this case, why would they? It makes no sense that sellers that the loan that I took over was the guy died. So wouldn't they rather have payments? I mean, otherwise this property's probably going into foreclosure. So to me, it's you've got to make a decision about it, and I think it's a pretty easy decision personally, but I know it will really worry some people out there.
Yeah, and I know you can get that objection a lot from sellers or agents of bringing up the due on sale clause if you're doing creative financing or wraps. And so knowing how to approach that, at least bring them some comfort, is a little helpful as well.
Yep. All right. So real quick, I want to be clear again the difference between a subject to and a wrap, right? And an exact wrap, right, Cody?
Yes, sir.
These would look identical except for a couple of things. Okay. So an exact wrap would be a new note that we create that's identical to the underlying note. So it's going to have the same balance, same interest, same monthly payment, same term. But because we're creating that new note, that new mortgage, that new trust deed, that there is a security instrument that's also being created that protects the seller, right? So now if there's some kind of default, the seller has recourse, which means that they can protect their interest in the property by foreclosing. In some states, okay, we've dealt with that. You got to know an exact wrap violates the due on sale clause, right? Title transfers. Keep that in mind. Subject to is taking over the loan without assuming it, right? Bank doesn't know. Bank's not giving its permission. You're not qualifying, and you are getting a deed. That is the document that you get at closing. Someone says, here's the deed to my property. I still owe money on it, so make sure it gets taken care of. However, that seller remains liable for that loan. And if there was a default, it would affect that seller's credit. If there was a personal guarantee, the bank could come after that seller. There is no security instrument, so the seller has no recourse. Seller cannot protect him or herself from a default. Really, the only thing they could do is bring a court action against everyone involved and see how it plays out. But more than likely, that will take much longer than the actual foreclosure process. Title
Yeah.
transfers as well, and it does violate the due on sale clause.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned this has gotten very popular, the subject to, and I've never understood why to use it if the exact wrap could do the same exact thing, but give the seller some recourse. Because I know I've talked to some people that do it and they've had the argument of like, well, I would never harm the seller. I'd always make sure they were protected. Like, well, if you don't care,
Right.
if you don't care about that, why not just use the exact wrap? Put the
Well,
protection in
I'll
place.
tell you one of the arguments. Okay, just
Yeah.
one. One might be is that sometimes title companies might not do a wrap on an FHA or a VA loan, but they may allow you to take it subject to.
Hmm.
Okay. So that could be an issue.
Yeah.
Second, it may be slightly easier to do a sub 2 transaction as in contrast to an exact wrap. Really, what it comes down to is who's the title company and or attorney that's involved. And if they understand all of it, then you're right. More than likely, it would be better to do an exact wrap because you get all the same benefits. The seller gets some security. And to be honest, so do you, because if everything goes wrong, right, and you end up in a court of law, you didn't do anything wrong. Look, this is what we agreed to. Things didn't work out, right? You don't go to jail if you get a loan from Bank of America, you make payments on it for 8 years, and then you lose your job, you have a health issue, and you stop making payments, and you lose your house, right? There are some negative things that happen with it, but you don't go to prison. You're not, there would be no difference here. However, if you did it as subject to, you put them in a position they can't protect themselves. And I just don't want a judge to randomly decide whether I was trying to deceive the seller to be from the beginning. And the judge might rule in my favor or might not. And I don't want that to happen, right? Because I don't have much of a case other than I said, look, I explained it thoroughly. I had them sign all this stuff, right, that they understood. But, you know, the judge could just say, I'm listening to what you're saying, but why would anyone do that? And
Mhm.
I don't want that, right? So I don't want that subjectivity going on with what happens to me. So,
Yeah. It just feels ethically like it takes out the gray area to keep it
yes.
with an exact wrap.
Yeah. So let's talk about some different situations. When would I use an exact wrap as opposed to subject to? One, when I'm paying all the equity to the seller at closing and going to keep the house to rent to own, or I'm going to retail or wholesale it. Okay. No problem. Take it subject to. Not a big deal. Not going to pay the seller all of their equity. So I'm going to create a new note at the time of closing. We like to refer to this as some now, some later, as far as seller's equity. Okay. I don't know why you would do that as subject to. I would absolutely do it 100% as a wrap. I know that it's becoming popular to do subject to on their underlying debt and then give a note for their equity. To me, that's a conflict of interest. It just doesn't even make sense. They don't go together. So for me, it's a wrap. They still have equity coming to them. That's a wrap. Going to wholesale the deal. You guys both know how I feel about that, right? I'm not wholesaling a sub 2 deal.
Mhm.
So we go with the wrap. Buying the property out of pre-foreclosure and reinstating the payments. Depending on what I'm planning on doing with the property, I could do either, and I'd feel pretty good about it. Probably have a lot more to do with my exit strategy than how I'm buying it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, a couple of ways that I want to talk about using wraps, and then we're going to wrap up this episode. Right? See, I did it again, Cody.
No pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended. We can create an exact wrap that will mirror the underlying debt. Okay. The terms of the new note will be identical to the underlying mortgage. If there is additional equity due to the seller, they'll be secured with another note in second position. Actually, it's in third position because the underlying note is number one, right? Now we're creating a second note that wraps around that that's exactly the same. And then we're creating a third one. I would always refer to it as the second mortgage, but in reality, it is a third mortgage, if that makes sense. Create one note that wraps around an existing mortgage and includes the seller's equity.
So just to get clarification on the first one,
Yeah.
for like an example's sake, so the underlying mortgage is say 100,000, and then you'd wrap for 100,000.
No.
and then the seller's equity would be 50,000. So if you're paying 150,
So let's say that the purchase price is 100
yep.
and they owe 50 and
Hmm.
you're putting down 10. Okay.
Okay.
And you are going to wrap that first mortgage an exact wrap, right?
The 50.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then you're going to create another note for the $40,000 of seller's equity. And you're going to treat that however you need to treat it. Now, there may be no payments, no interest. There may be payments, there may be interest. But the seller's equity kind of stays intact through a separate note. And on the second one, we're just creating one note. Okay. On that same example, let's say we put down 10 grand, we're creating a note for $90,000. And that 90,000 includes the 50 and
Hmm.
their $40,000 in equity. And we'll go through the next two episodes that we go through will be strictly examples of how
Okay.
this works.
Okay. That's helpful.
Nicole, are you with us?
Yes.
You
This was a
following?
lot of learning for me because I've never heard of a exact wrap, to be honest. So I've been
You probably
sitting here.
have, and you just didn't realize it.
Yeah, probably.
Because you'll see how we're going to use it in just a minute, and it'll probably like, oh, yeah, I think I know what they're talking about now. Okay, Cody, anything else you want to add?
No, this was a great episode. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, so stay with us. Our next episode and the next two episodes will include three different examples and how they're used, why we use them. I promise you stay through these 4 episodes. At the very least, you'll have a lot better understanding of wraps. All right, go out and create some terms.